Hi, everybody. I'm Karyn Kusama, and I am here to moderate a Q&A with Veena Sud, who directed The Lie. And I just want to say hello to all of the viewers from Fantastic Fest and from Fangoria and anyone else who's just watched the movie. We'll try and give a little bit of a heads up if we have a big spoiler coming. But for those of you who have watched the movie, we want to obviously talk about the actual movie and its plot. Veena, I'm so excited to talk to you.
And very, very excited.
I've actually seen the movie twice. So I think it's really interesting to see it a second time because there's a lot of nuance in the performances that I could now understand in a different way. But I'm curious to hear about your relationship to this to the film and to making the film. I didn't realize it was adapted from a film from 2015. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. Thank you so much for doing this, Karyn. And you were such an instrumental part actually early on. Karyn was, for our audience members, and an amazing director who I've admired for so long. And she was so generous to come to our friends and family screening early on. And you gave the most brilliant note, which I just want to credit you for and to say thank you so much.
That's so sweet.
Yeah, it was very true. It helped me kind of find my way, because a lot of times at the beginning of a film, you're still looking, you're still kind of, they say you write a film 3 times, when you write it, when you shoot it, and then when you're editing it. And certainly by that point, you're kind of, on the ropes, because that's the last chance. The film came to me through my producer, Alix Madigan, who is just this incredible woman who supported other women, directors. And she had seen the film at Toronto, the original film, We Are Monsters, which was a German film by Sebastien. She gave it to me. I saw it and I was enraptured by the idea of the idea of parents protecting a child and how far we go for people we love. And I knew, anytime you do an adaptation, I've done The Killing as an adaptation, you really have to bring in your own heart and experience and soul into a film to actually make it more than a transcript of another artist's idea. And the 2 huge pieces that I felt really I wanted to own, and now for all the audience out there who've seen it, I can actually talk about this, which is so lovely. But big spoiler alert for anybody who has not seen the film. You may not want to listen anymore. The German film told the audience within the first 20 minutes that Brittany was alive.
So that's interesting.
Very, very interesting. The filmmaker made the decision early on to let the audience in on the girl's secret. And what that did for me as an audience member watching Sebastien's work was watch in horror, in absolute horror, these parents running through a maze that they did not have to run through. And there was almost like a dark comedy aspect to it, which was so delicious. And the way Sebastien shot it, it was remarkable. It was like a perfect piece of music for what he was doing with that reveal. I, on the other hand, really wanted to make the audience, as much as possible, be on the ride with the parents and not know that it was a hoax. And so making that decision, was a big one. It made it very different from the German film. And it was also something that I struggled mightily to actually hide as long as I possibly could. The big fear early on was people would guess. And especially with a movie called The Lie, they would guess what the lie was. Yeah. So there's a lot of conversations about it. There's Alix and I and the editor and Couper and Jason, at Blumhouse, we had a lot of conversations about what's the fine line between hiding this hoax and letting the audience kind of be on this ride as long as possible.
That's interesting, because I actually felt like from the opening 10 minutes, there's so many lies that the larger question is when, not even which lie, but when do the lies stop? The sense of the interpersonal betrayals and the interpersonal deceptions, I guess, even the notion of the two girls sitting in the back seat, and that there's clearly so much kind of girl hostility there. And so there's already a friendship forged in a kind of deception. I just assumed in a weird way that the lie was a larger question in a funny way.
And I love that, because I think it is, because it is, the meta of the lie is what we don't talk about, and in this family, it's an extreme situation that they're not talking about until they absolutely have to. But in all families, what secrets kind of lie beneath, these waters of quiet and stillness, and and deception. So it was very, it was a balancing act to really try to make sure, in my mind at least, that this big giant reveal not be given away too soon.
Yes.
And then the other piece that was really different from Sebastian's film was I really wanted to talk, especially at the time when we were in production and I was writing, about anti-Muslim sentiment and racism in the criminal justice system. And I had just come off 7 Seconds, my TV show, which talks about police violence. And I purposely wanted Sam to be Pakistani, to be Muslim, the murdered missing girl, Brittany, to be a young girl of color, and to play out those politics of what it looks like when a man of color is clearly the victim. And because of America and because of the criminal justice system and assumptions, et cetera, and, this kind of giant kind of xenophobia that this country, unfortunately, is born of and continues to have, that I wanted to make it very clear that, and the audience is appalled, in that scene when the cops show up at his doorstep and basically just launch into accusatory, saying that he basically may have killed his daughter and was a violent man, et cetera. All founded on basically nothing, on a young girl's kind of claim. So yeah, those were the two things that were the biggest changes.
It's interesting to see the film a second time since I saw that early cut, and particularly in the design and in the nods toward the shared wealth of the family, the relative comfort of the family, the habit of something that I think we associate with privilege, like ballet. I saw the film a little differently this time, more as an exploration or kind of an indictment of whiteness, or the privileges that come with whiteness. And I'm curious if that was in relation to what you're talking about in terms of the anti-Muslim sentiment, but was it important that they be wealthy, that they be, privileged in all of those ways? I'm just curious as you were making it.
Yeah, I mean, it was really important. It was a nod to whiteness and to the privilege of whiteness, and
it makes whiteness awfully ugly.
I mean, there's a lot of white in this movie, right?
Yeah, it's incredible.
House, there's white curtains,
snow, so much snow,
and that palette was really important to me and the DP and the production designer, because I mean, blood against white is really terrifying. Violence against seemingly an innocent color is very terrifying. Indicting whiteness, in the meta was certainly part of the conversation I was having early on. Again, when I was making my own adaptation of this film, it's the question that was in my mind was whose child matters in this country. And Peter Sarsgaard and I had a really interesting conversation early on when we first met about the film. And we were talking about the Syrian kids, who are fleeing Syria and washing up on the shores of Greece and Italy, and the almost numbness that, was going on kind of in America around the deaths of these children. And Peter said, because it's not their children. There's this disconnect people make to children of color, to third world children, to Black children, to brown children, that white people make and white culture makes, that then makes their deaths not as important. So, all of that was at play, in this film, and subtly kind of woven throughout.
It's interesting though, because what you bring up, it actually gets me thinking about another reaction I've had to the film both times, and that I think is so interesting, is that I don't feel like you're creating a world in which it's even so much villains or innocent victims, but that in terms of this family unit, you could argue everyone is to blame, no one is to blame, but there's no sort of classical structure of villain and good guy. Mm-hmm. And that really becomes clear in the end when Kayla reveals the lie. There's a moment in which we see the parents look at their own child and say, you feel in the performances that they are kind of feeling like, you are not my child. And that was that's interesting, this notion of, in a way, privilege serving everyone in the short term, but in the long term, everyone is ruined by it, because they've all been, I mean, now they're just forever marred, and who knows what's going to happen once that doorbell rings. But I think it's really fascinating to be thinking about how in other examinations of this kind of storyline, the parents would be the villain or the kid would be evil, but in this case, it's sort of like they're all operating in this very uncomfortable gray area.
Yeah. I mean, this is why I so appreciated you coming in and giving us, the brilliant note you did, which, I'll share with the audience. It's easy sometimes to go into villain territory, especially with a story like this. It's mm-hmm. very hard for any of us to relate to people who do bad things, because mm-hmm. all of us believe we're good people at heart. And so, I was skating in one version, I think early on, closer to, making bad guy stuff was happening. Bad guy mm-hmm. feelings were happening around Kayla, certainly. And again, it's like, how do you, because no one knows until the very end of the film that this girl just made it all up. That's why she seems like she has no remorse. So as you're watching the film, not knowing that it's a hoax, thinking she actually murdered somebody, you're thinking this young girl's a sociopath. She's insane. Mm-hmm. And so we were playing that note. We were edging that note probably louder than we should have. And the beautiful note Karyn gave us was, play this like a drama, play this just like the story about a family. And so that really, I think, helped us find the exactly perfect place where we could live with this film, where it wasn't a mockery kind of teenage girlhood and she's crazy, that kind of, mm-hmm. Stuff that, it's so easy to go to. I think it's evoked, from what I've seen, and the audience tonight probably feels, really complicated feelings, mm-hmm. And it depends on who you are. It depends on how old you are. It depends on if you have kids, if you don't have kids. There is a spectrum of feelings around Kayla and the family that I think is really, really interesting, and says a lot about us, how we're mm-hmm. reacting to these characters.
Yeah. And also just the notion that, and I felt it a lot watching it again, this idea that children play with transgression, but lack the ability to understand consequences. And I think it's interesting then to see the parents act impulsively, but clearly also missing the consequences ahead of them in a way that, the pileup just keeps getting worse and worse, particularly near the end, as it relates to the missing girl's dad. It just becomes an untenable slope that they'd go down on some, in some moral universe. Yeah. And it's interesting then to have the biggest lie of the plot be something that reveals kind of the folly of children, and just, it makes me think of, like, when my son was 2 and would hold a glass of milk and watch me as I watched him pour it on the floor just to see what would happen. And that notion of like, we just thought it would be funny. It's a really nice, complicated moment because particularly in Peter's character, you feel like he's looking at this child like a stranger.
Mm-hmm. And of course, she has no idea what transpired the night before.
I know.
She's just in trouble. Somehow they found out, she has no idea that, they went and killed somebody. So yeah, I mean, I've raised a son and I've seen teenagers, and I'm always amazed at how, it's like goldfish memory. It's 5 seconds, 5 seconds of thinking and then no idea what happened afterwards. And just as a parent, like raw, openness, driving teenagers in cars and they're telling each other everything. And you're like, I'm right here. I can hear everything that you just said. Like,
yes.
Yeah. And, it's like, it's a brain that's still, neuroscience is finding like still in massive development until
totally
25. So there are serious consequences for treating teenagers, like adults too soon. So I was very, very interested in really rooting Kayla in that reality. But again, because no one knows except her that it's a hoax, the first thing everyone's thinking is, my God, this child's a complete brat.
I'm curious, as you were making the film and preparing to make the film, were you thinking stylistically about other movies? Were you looking at other films, or were you kind of just, given that it was an adaptation, sort of burrowing into what it was? Like, what was your process there?
I mean, the process usually for me is very visual. So I will usually, it's always a first image. That's kind of what the hook is, the emotional hook is for me. And the first image was water. There had to be something with water that would be the center of the story. And initially we were going to shoot in summer. I wanted this kind of very bucolic mid-America setting, like Ohio. And then, we had to go at a certain time. And I realized how lucky that was, because I did want that very pristine palette, the white on the white, and the cool and the blue, tones. And so Denis Villeneuve's work, is always influential. Prisoners was a big film we talked about a lot. Let the Right One In, because of the white on the white on the white, and the snow and the cold and the silence. The silence was a big key element in thinking about when people talk, when they don't, and also the house was a huge element that we spent a lot of time talking about and thinking about, because the family and so much of the film happens in these basically 2 to 3 rooms of a house, which when you're shooting that over and over and over, it's a white house with white walls with nothing in it, and windows. It could get completely boring and repetitive, and it's very difficult to shoot anyway with those conditions. So the search for the house was probably the most important thing we did in prep, besides talk about design, and finding a house that fit the idea of people who live in glass houses was really important. The sterility of the design was really important. And then the way we got very, very lucky, because the way the walls are, there's a slight curve to them, which is great. Yeah. And so there's slightly, in this perfect kind of perfectly controlled environment, there's something slightly wrong, slightly off to the eye, off kilter. So I
really loved the exterior. I love those houses that have this kind of brutal symmetry, but also there is a forbidding quality to them, that kind of aesthetic. And it was interesting to kind of note that it's not like all the other houses looked like that. That house looked like that on that block. And it was clearly meant to be a show of power. Just the construction of it and the lines of it. And I appreciated that the house had a kind of sort of modern day fortress quality to it.
Yeah, and control.
Yes.
It's a fortress of glass, which is about comfort and privilege and looking out at the world. But when you're trying to hide inside that house and hide your secrets, it's a house of glass and everyone can look in. Yeah. So Hitchcock was another huge influence.
Yeah.
You know, slow, quiet, tormented unrolling of tension. As Kayla's in the house, especially when Sam comes and he's ringing the doorbell in the scene, and there's nowhere to hide. You know, there's literally nowhere to hide in a house of glass. So playing, it was really lovely, not easy, but very fun for me to play with the curtains and play with those windows and the frosted glass.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Was this a pretty fast shoot, or did you get quite a bit of time? What was the production schedule like?
It was 23 and a half days. So
that's fast.
Yeah, it was fast. It was very, very fast. And it was also one of the most brutal conditions I've ever shot in. And I've shot in 4 years of torrential rain in Vancouver. So we were in -40. At one point we were in Toronto, and Toronto experienced their worst winter in recent memory, and it went down to -40.
Wow.
And I remember thinking and even the Canadians were like, what is going on? You know, but I was in so much gear. I basically my friends were like, you look like General Hux from Star Wars. Like you're just like, this, like giant, like you're in a tent. Like I can't even see you. And I was still cold.
Yeah.
You know? The actors were amazing because they had to wear their wardrobe and run around outside. And Peter's
and Peter's whole opening thing of running through that lake or that river. I mean, oh my God, it looked brutal.
Yeah. It was so cold. We had a warming tent for him. He was in a wetsuit, you know, underneath the wardrobe. And by the way, icy conditions, Arctic conditions, and I think a few hundred feet down the river where he jumped in, there was a giant waterfall, like a deadly waterfall. And so we had lines there, we had divers there, we had all sorts of safety there. And Peter was just game to go for it.
Amazing. That's amazing. I want to say to anyone who's watching this who doesn't know that Veena created The Killing, it's one of the great shows on television. And I particularly think about the first season as it relates to this film. And we don't have a ton of time, but I would love to hear from you about this notion of families as the site of elemental horror, because I see a relationship between the two.
I just want to also say my DP was my DP on The Killing.
Fantastic.
It was a wonderful reunion for us, and
that's great.
He and I and Mireille to be together again.
That's great.
Yeah, I mean, family is the center of it all, right? It's where it all comes from. It's our first love. It's our first meals. It's our first sense of warmth and our first terror, you know, and the abandonment and pain. And so it all comes from this place. And so it has been, I guess, the loci for me of a lot of interest in examining kind of the truth underneath, the truth underneath the appearance. I grew up in Ohio, and I grew up in Southern Ohio, which is the southern part of the state for a reason. And we didn't fit in, you know, my family and I didn't fit in. And there were a lot of kind of unspoken things. You know, my parents were immigrants, and they came here with the intention to be part of. And so there was so much in our family that we had to hide, you know, and suppress, and our culture and kind of the way we did things. It wasn't really done there like that. And so there always feels to me as a daughter of immigrants, I don't know if you feel the same way, but there's like who you really are when you're at home, and then there's the other part of you that goes into the world and presents a certain way.
The forward facing self.
To be accepted, you know. And so that duality has always been really, really interesting to me.
Well, it's a really fascinating thread to explore. And to anyone watching who loved The Lie, you should definitely check out The Killing if you haven't already. It's brilliant. Veena, this was so great. I'm so glad we could chat.
Me too. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, everybody. I'm going to say goodbye to the Fantastic Fest viewers, to the Fangoria viewers, and to anyone who's checking this out on YouTube after watching The Lie as part of Amazon's Welcome to the Blumhouse series. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you. Thanks for watching.
Okay.